Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I think you are about to see this is a fascinating and exciting survey. I'm E.J. Dionne, a senior fellow here at Brookings, and on behalf of myself and my friend, colleague, and fellow senior fellow, Bill Galston, I want to welcome you all here today. This is the sixth year of our partnership with PRRI on polling. What you will find, I don't want to preclude Robbie Jones's patented excellent PowerPoint, but I just want to say that this survey is extraordinary for showing both how divided we are as a country, why we are divided, and how much we're going to have to deal with after this election is over. And I'm only hoping that when we perhaps do our ninth year together, Robbie will be able to present a survey about how we have come together as a nation. Someday, I'm praying for that, but that's also a sign of my confidence in this great partnership. Bill will introduce our very distinguished panel. I want to thank all of them. I always like to say thank you at the beginning, so all the people who were so helpful to us to make sure we get thanked. Obviously, from our end at Brookings, thanks to Robbie Jones and Dan Cox. They've been wonderful partners. We've had a great time working with them. I want to thank over at PRRI, Joanna Piacenza and Jessica Walthall for their support in coordinating the rollout. Robbie will probably thank some other folks. Here at Brookings, I want to thank the entire governance studies and events and media staff, also our vice president and the head of our program, Daryl West. Thanks to Anna Goodbaum and Liz Sablich, my colleague Bill, Adam Waters, and Mo Batal for doing fantastic work. Robbie Jones is the CEO of PRRI, a leading scholar on religion, culture, and politics. He is the author of The End of White Christian America. If you haven't bought Robbie's book yet, you should. It's a really excellent account of, and it kind of presages a lot of things that are happening in this campaign. He's the author of two other books. He writes a column for The Atlantic on politics and culture. He appears regularly in Faith by the Numbers. That's a theologically interesting concept. Faith by the Numbers segment on Interfaith Voices. He is a frequent guest on CNN, NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, all over, and many other places. And he is the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section at the American Academy of Religion. It's a real joy once again to welcome Robbie here to Brookings to present the findings of this fascinating survey. Robbie Jones.
Well, thanks, everyone. Great to see everyone here on a beautiful day when you could be sitting out in the park, but now you're here. And also want to congratulate everyone on your stamina for wanting to hear more about the election at this time in the election season. So I want to just begin with a few thank yous of my own. First, to kind of return the gratitude to EJ and Bill. I think this is actually our seventh year, 2010 to today. So I think this is number 7.
I guess I just did 16 minus 10.
Yeah, so we have one more year, right? So I think we're in our 7th year, this partnership, and it's been a really fantastic, one of the things, I think we all agree, one of the most fun things we do every year. I mean, there's a lot of work that goes into it, but the partnership is really fantastic. I want to thank on our end, the research team, Betsy Cooper, Rachel Lenich, Dan Cox, and also on our communications team, Harmeet Kamboj, Jessica Walthall, and Joanna Piacenza for that. And then I have a special shout out here for our cover image today, which I think is maybe fitting with the way this election cycle has kind of gone, the kind of craziness of the election cycle. But I want to credit Robbie Prieto, great name, who is 13 years old, and we got this image on Flickr, and what he has been doing is he set up Lego images of the entire primary debate and would winnow it down every time somebody dropped out, and so this is where he was left with his Lego image staging of the election. So he's up in New Hampshire, and we're going to send him a few copies of the report that he can pass out to all his middle school friends. But anyway, I want to say thank you for this great cover image. Yes, that's worth a hand. Here Okay, so let's kind of just going to dive in here, and I do want to say one remark before I get started about what this survey is and isn't. This survey, we have done some horse race surveys, but this one was really not designed to be the latest in the horse race, but really was designed to take a step back and look at what the bigger picture, the underlying dynamics that are kind of informing where the horse race is and isn't going. So what we really wanted to do was to kind of step back from the frenzy and look at what we think is going on underneath, where these divides are coming from, and also because we think this may set the stage pretty well for thinking, as EJ said, what we all have to do after the election. Whoever wins, these divisions will still be living with us, and we'll have to figure out from elections to governing how that transition happens with these divides still with us. So with that, let me just jump in to some of the main findings today. There is a kind of classic question that pollsters always ask, they usually kick off their surveys with, is America headed in the right direction or is it off on the wrong track? This is about where the country is today. You can see only about a quarter of Americans say that we're going in the right direction. Big partisan divide, but notable that we only get to 42% among Democrats saying that things are heading in the right direction. The twist that we added here is among those who said we were going on the wrong track, we asked them a follow-up question about whether this had happened just in the last few years or whether we had just been on the wrong track for a long time. And you begin to see some differences when this all gets filled out. I mean, basically, the country is more likely to say we've been on the wrong track for a long time than just in the last few years. And Republicans, though, are more likely to say wrong track just in the last few years than they are to say long time. You see independents overwhelmingly saying we've been on the wrong track for a long time. A majority, in fact, say that, whereas Democrats are a little more divided, but still more likely to say we've been on the wrong track for a long time. And we can come back and revisit this a little bit in the Q&A or in the discussion part of it. But that's a kind of more nuanced picture than we usually get from this wrong track question. Despite that, this is one interesting thing we found, is that when we ask about whether the current generation is better off, about the same, or worse off financially than your children's generation will be, we actually found slightly less pessimism in this survey, which is a little bit surprising to us. So in June of 2013, we found a majority of the country saying that their generation would be better off than their children's generation would be. It's dropped a bit down to 39% now. It didn't go that far. They basically moved from more pessimistic to kind of neutral on the question. There's not much difference on the other side, right? That they were kind of worse off, meaning that the next generation will be better off here. So that's sort of one notable maybe caveat to the pessimistic mood in the country. We also see huge partisan divides on many, many issues about which ones are critical issues in the country. I'm going to show you two slides now. They're both sorted in descending order by Republican priorities, right? So if you look at this, you can see the red dots kind of are sliding and the Democratic dots are bouncing around depending on where they are, but it's sorted by Republican. So up at the top, what's notable here is that there's a kind of bipartisan agreement that terrorism is really at the top of the list here. So both parties very, very high, 2/3 of Democrats, more than 8 in 10 Republicans saying terrorism is a critical issue. On the deficit, big party divides. Parties come back together again on jobs and employment, saying these are very high issues. Immigration, another big 20-point plus partisan divide. And then crime, really about the same. So basically what you see here is federal deficit and immigration are where you see the big partisan divides on this slate of issues here. Now here's the rest. If I keep going down, this is the first 5. Here's the second batch of these. Kind of, again, in descending order by Republican priorities here. Fairness of presidential elections, it's up there, but doesn't reach majority really with either party as a critical issue. Trade, another big difference here, but look at race relations and the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Democrats actually rank these among their top issues, right? So they're 6 and 10 or more, while they're at the very bottom of the list for Republicans, right? So this is like one of the biggest areas of difference here, race relations, growing gap between the rich and the poor. That issue, 40 points, 30 points here. These are really big partisan divides in terms of priorities and where the country's going. So let me say a little bit about kind of what we found in the horse race numbers. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor, we did go back in the field. So this survey, most of the data in the survey was from a field period in late September. And then we went back in the field with a follow-up survey just to ask questions about the horse race numbers to kind of update where they are. This is what sort of PRI tracking polls are showing really from late September all the way up into last week. Through mid-October, and we basically shown Hillary Clinton opening up a double-digit lead. They were dead even in our polling among likely voters in late September, now into double-digit lead into mid-October. The religion in this election has been pretty interesting. For the longest time, what we basically have seen is this pattern of white Christian voters leaning toward Republican candidates and essentially everyone else leaning toward Democratic presidential candidates. And so here's where we are today. This are kind of overall numbers. I want to kind of bookend these two things on the end of the religion world. So on the one hand, white evangelical Protestant voters. These have been the bedrock of Republican constituencies over time. They tend to vote at the exit polls and the final votes around 8 and 10 for Republican candidates. The religiously unaffiliated on the far other side of the thing tend to vote about 3/4 or more for Democratic candidates. And these two groups, very, very different, right? So these, the religiously unaffiliated, obviously not attending churches that often, white evangelical Protestants, attending religious services very, very often, and having really different political views here. We did not have enough to break out minority Protestants or like Latino Catholics in this particular survey, so that's why they're not here. But you can see the main line is still leaning toward Donald Trump. That's about where they've been in the exit polls historically, at least since Reagan. And then Catholics, Hillary Clinton with a healthy lead among Catholics. The really interesting thing about the Catholic vote, though, is not the overall Catholic vote, but the white Catholic vote. Mitt Romney won white Catholics by 19 points, and in our last survey, white Catholics are running even between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So that's a real interesting one to vote, to watch, particularly because places like Pennsylvania, 30% of Pennsylvania's voters are white Catholics, and even in Ohio, 1 in 5 are white Catholics. So in some of these battleground states, this will loom very, very large. Here, I think, is one of the more shocking findings that we found, kind of tracing these numbers over time. So we asked a question in 2011 that said, an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can still behave ethically and fulfill their duties in their public and professional life. So in 2011, here's basically what we saw. Less than half of Americans agreed with this statement. The group most likely to, or least likely to agree with this statement were white evangelical Protestants. The group most likely to agree, the religiously unaffiliated. Now that's 2011. So today, this is what that number looks like. So white evangelicals have gone from being the least likely group to agree with this statement to the most likely group to agree with this statement. And what's interesting is that religiously unaffiliated haven't moved on this question, right? They're exactly where they were before, but the country as a whole has been moved by this election on this question, right? Into being more accepting of this divide between a politician's personal life and their public life. We found one other piece of evidence of how this has changed, really particularly white evangelicals over time. That we asked this, thinking about your vote for president, how important is it for a candidate to have strong religious beliefs? Here is 2016 versus 2011 among white evangelicals, right? They've gone from being 2/3 saying this is very important to them to less than half saying this is very important to them. Again, a sort of like gravitational effect of the Trump campaign on white evangelicals in this election cycle. We're still showing, by the way, white evangelicals supporting Donald Trump even after the release of the tapes at 69%, 7 in 10 supporting Donald Trump. And then you get the somewhat important, still a little bit lower, and here's the not so important. But what really matters here is, I think, is this real intensity around how important it is for a candidate to have strong religious beliefs. So let's look a little bit down about the candidates themselves and about parties. We asked the survey asked a whole range of attributes of the two candidates. Which candidate does this attribute you think apply more to, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? So over on the left, you can't quite read in the back. It's from left to right. It's is honest and trustworthy, is a strong and decisive leader, has strong religious beliefs, cares about people like you, will use American military power responsibly, understands the problems of poor Americans, has the right temperament and personality to be president, has the right experience to be president. So here are Donald Trump's numbers among likely voters all across here. You can see basically it doesn't crack 50% on any of these candidate attributes this is among everyone. And here are Hillary Clinton's numbers across these. So essentially what happens is on the two issues of is honest and trustworthy and is a strong and decisive leader, they're essentially tied. But then on every other issue, there's a significant lead for Hillary Clinton in perception on these particular candidate attributes. One other thing we tried to figure out is just how segregated in terms of candidate preference the American public was, and we asked the question whether people had a close friend or family member who was supporting either candidate to try to get a sense of just how isolated voters were. So among all Americans, it's not that interesting. About more than 6 in 10 say yes, they've got someone in my network who, or my close friend or family network who supports one or the other of the candidates. But it gets a little more interesting when you start unpacking by demographics. So partisans are about equally as likely so among Democrats, about 4 in 10 say they have a close friend or family member supporting Trump. It's about the same among Republicans. You get a little dispersion by social class among whites. Not that much, actually, among white college-educated Americans. Almost as many say either candidate. But among white working-class Americans, only half say they know anyone who have a close friend or family member supporting Hillary Clinton. When you break it out by race, you see, again, among whites, not a lot of difference there. It starts becoming more lopsided among Latinos. But when you get to African Americans, only 20% of African Americans say they have a close friend or family member who's supporting Donald Trump. So that's a pretty overwhelming, kind of social segregation on that particular question. One other thing that's probably not going to surprise too many people, given the mood in the country, is that we had a question that we tracked back to a USA Today poll back in 1990 that basically says, neither political party represents my views anymore. The country was basically divided on this question in 1990, and today not so divided, right? 6 in 10 say neither political party represents my views. Only 4 in 10 disagree with that statement. So the pretty high dissatisfaction with the current party setup. Some other things that have really, a couple of other questions that have been grabbing headlines lately about how much confidence do Americans have in the election, that the elections are going to be fair, that their votes are going to be counted accurately. And we find actually that less than half of Americans say they have a great deal of confidence that their vote will be counted accurately, only 43%, in fact. And there is a huge gap, right, between those who are likely voters supporting Trump and likely voters supporting Clinton on this question. Is basically 30 points here, where only 41% of Trump likely voters say they have a great deal of confidence, but 70% of Hillary Clinton's supporters say they have a great deal of confidence. When you add another 4 in 10 of Americans say they have only some confidence, and then there's not that many that say they have hardly any confidence, but it's 1 in 5, depends on kind of, you want to look at this glass half empty or half full. 1 in 5 Americans say they have hardly any confidence that their vote is going to get counted accurately in the upcoming election. So we also see some real polarization on concerns about this basic question about we asked Americans, what do you think is the bigger problem in the U.S.? People casting votes who are not eligible to vote, or eligible voters being denied the right to vote? So essentially, these two sides of this question. And among all Americans, about 4 in 10 say they're pretty divided, about 4 in 10 on either side. But when you look at the partisan divides, you begin to see this very, very different view, right? So Republicans, 2/3 saying it's people casting votes who are not, so essentially voter fraud is the bigger problem, and Democrats, 6 in 10 saying eligible voters being denied the right to vote, voter disenfranchisement. So this polarized view of what the bigger problems in the country are. Independents look about like the rest of the country on this question. Also wanted to kind of put this up by race. You can begin to see the differences here. So among African Americans, 2/3 saying this voter disenfranchisement, about half of Latinos saying that. And you look at whites here. And what's interesting about this is I was actually expecting there might be a class divide among whites on this question, and there really isn't much of a class divide. So it really is race more than class driving attitudes on this particular question. One other question around race that I wanted to kind of raise, because we're seeing some interesting patterns here, is about on the question of police officers generally treating blacks and other minorities the same as whites. There is a huge partisan divide on this question, right? 80% of Republicans agree with that statement, that police officers do, in fact, treat blacks and other minorities the same as whites. Only 32% of Democrats agree with that statement. And you can see it kind of filling out this way. 2/3, they're really mirror opposites of each other by party. And then, by the way, I don't have African Americans up here, but only 19% of African Americans agree with this statement, right? That police treat African Americans the same as whites. But here I want to break out whites by party and look at what has happened over time. What's interesting is just between last year and this year, the agreement with the statement among whites has gone up. It's gone up not just among Republicans, but it's gone up among Democrats as well, 10 points even among Democrats. So it really is whites across the political spectrum agreeing with the statement more than they did just a year ago. So we're having kind of a racial divide is opening up even more over this past year with African Americans. They're moving a little bit, but really within the margin of error, and whites moving significantly on this question. All right, so down the home stretch here, one of the ways we had this cover and kind of thinking about what's the big picture of this election and what's it about. We haven't had a lot of grand issue debates, right, in this election so far. So what's going on? What's behind it? And so one of the things we heard a lot about early on, in particular, was this issue of political correctness, right? Now my suspicion is this stands in for a whole lot of things, but we decided to try to get a question that might get at this a little bit, and it's a little bit wordy, but here's what we said: which of the following statements come to your own view? We offered people two statements. Even if certain people are offended, it is important to speak frankly about sensitive issues and problems facing the country. Or, it's important to avoid using language that is hurtful and offensive to some people when discussing sensitive issues. So among all Americans, actually, 6 in 10 agree with the first statement, that even if certain people are offended, it's important to speak frankly about sensitive issues and problems facing the country. What we see, though, is that it's really white men who are more likely to agree with this statement. There's a big gender divide here on this question. It also shows up even among non-white men and women, so it's both gender and race a bit here. So non-white men, majority agree with the first statement. Non-white women, majority agree with the second statement. But look at white men here. 7 in 10 agree with the first statement. White women, actually, in majority, barely, but 52%. And then it looks basically the same by class. Again, no big class difference on this question. We were thinking we might see a much bigger class difference among whites on this question. Big gender divide on the question of whether the country would be better off if we had more women in political office. 6 in 10 Americans agree, but men are divided while women are kind of off the charts on this question. Maybe not a big surprise, but it is interesting to see the men who are basically evenly divided on this question, while women are basically 2 to 1 on this particular question. And then the other place where we obviously have seen a lot of rhetoric and a lot of divides between the two parties is on the issue of immigration and immigrants and what role immigrants play in the country. Do they make a contribution to the country? Are they a burden on the country? And on this question, again, a two-statement question, which is closer to your own view. The growing number of newcomers from other countries threatens traditional American customs and values, or the growing number of newcomers from other countries strengthens American society. So among all Americans, we basically have a divide here, but this, again, massive partisan difference, right? 73% of Republicans agreeing with the first statement. The growing number of newcomers threatens traditional American customs and values. Only 29% of Democrats agreeing with that statement. Here you can see the other side. of that question. When it comes to particular policies on this question, we have two questions here about favor or oppose building a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, temporarily banning Muslims from other countries from entering the U.S. Less than half of the country agrees with those or favors those policies, but Republicans are overwhelmingly in favor. Or actually, these are Trump supporters, like Trump voters, overwhelmingly in favor. Clinton likely voters, like nowhere near, favoring these. Less than 1 in 5 Clinton voters favoring these policies. So again, just these huge divides by party and candidate support. And I'm going to end on this question. If you've been at these events before, you may have seen this question. We've asked this question over the last 2 or 3 years, but I think it continues to be really salient for what's happening in the country today. And we titled the report "The Divide." Are we talking about 1950 or 2050? And this question that we've asked is, since the 1950s, do you think American culture and way of life has mostly changed for the better, or has it mostly changed for the worse? As you can see, the country is right on a line, actually, but is divided right down the middle on this question about whether it's changed for the better or changed for the worse. I'm going to put the two strongest change for the better groups kind of out here on the side. These are not mutually exclusive groups across the bottom, and I'll flag them in case you can't read them. But basically, 2/3 of Democrats and the religiously unaffiliated over there, the kind of two big, strong groups that stand out as saying things have mostly changed for the better. And if I do that on the other side, we end up with white evangelical Protestants and Republicans on the other side. So again, the kind of some of the most religious white Americans on the one hand, some of the least religious white Americans on the other, mostly white Americans on the other hand, and the two political parties on opposite sides of this question, and literally mirror images of one another. So I think it's not really a stretch to say that one of the things happening in this election is it really is a referendum on the future. Does the future look like we're going to reach back to something in the past, or are we going to lean in to the cultural and demographic and all other kinds of changes that are happening in the country, and even celebrate those changes? Is there more good there than bad? I think those are some of the bigger questions. If I fill the rest of it in, I'll just read them because I know they're kind of small. But on this side of mostly change for the better, we have Hispanic Catholics, African Americans as a whole, Americans under the age of 30, Hispanics as a whole, and white college-educated Americans on that side. And fill in the rest over here on mostly change for the worse. It's whites overall, actually. Those seniors, mainline Protestants, white Catholics, and white working-class Americans over on the other side. So you can kind of see something of a pattern emerging with these differences. So I'm sure we're going to unpack this a little more in the discussion. I'm going to kind of leave it right there with this question about nostalgia in the 1950s for you. So thank you. Oh, great. Put it back? Yeah. Okay.
Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you're all as dazzled as I always am by Robbie's whiz-bang presentations. I'm Bill Galston, a senior fellow in governance studies here at Brookings, and E.J. Dionne's co-conspirator from the Brookings side for the past 7 years. There are full biographies of the panelists in your packet, and I'm not going to waste time reading those bios. Suffice it to say that Carlin Bowman is a senior fellow and research coordinator at the American Enterprise Institute, and I think she has the entire history of survey research in her head. She is a national resource. Next, Perry Bacon. making his Brookings debut, I have learned, but he's anything but a neophyte, a longtime political journalist. He's currently serving as senior political reporter at NBC. I think I got to know him first when he was still at the Washington Post all those many years ago. And finally, Henry Olson, a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, an increasingly well-known commentator on American politics, wrestling with the problems of the future of a conservative movement consistent with conservative principles, which these days is a pretty significant caveat, I would say. Each of the panelists has a maximum of 10 minutes, which I will strictly enforce, because otherwise we're not going to get it all in, to lay out some opening remarks. Then EJ and I will stimulate a little bit of crosstalk among the panelists, and then it's over to you. Carlin.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I thought I'd begin this morning just by congratulating EJ and Bill on Brookings' 100th anniversary, which they're celebrating this month. We came on the scene at AEI in 1943, and I think over the years there's probably been a lot of competition between our think tanks, but probably much more collegiality. And because I've been at AEI forever, I decided to look back this morning at our board books from the 40s and 50s to see if I could find the first collaboration between AEI and Brookings. And it actually happened in 1947. I have no idea what the results were. I've never seen any paperwork on it, but we were asked by the Lodge brothers, senator and representative, to look into the satellite peace treaties in Western Europe. And again, I don't know what happened to that, but that was our first collaboration. But I'd also like to, of course, congratulate Robbie and his team on this new poll, because I think he's helped us to drill down to understand not only the election, but the broader public mood. And I think it provides many clues why Hillary Clinton's lead has been expanding, while her appeal has not. Her massive 28 percentage point lead on having the right temperament and personality to be president, and her 33-point lead on having the right background and experience, I think explains a lot of her lead at this point. As they note, neither candidate's favorable ratings have changed much since the nomination, though more recent data suggests that Hillary's supporters' enthusiasm about her is beginning to grow. That, in a nutshell, I think, are these findings that explain why most people in this poll and other recent polls expect her to win, but not by a landslide, by a narrow margin. Robbie mentioned white Catholics. We pay special attention to white Catholics because they're one of the few groups in American politics that has a near perfect record of voting for the winner, and they're solidly in Hillary's camp at this point. I was especially impressed about what Robbie called the new twist on the right track, wrong track question. As he said, they asked whether the country's been on the right track for only a short period of time, or the wrong track for only a short period of time, or for a longer period. And the results were 44% for a long time, 30% said that we'd been on the wrong track only for the past few years. If I could make another suggestion about adding a new question to this, I'd like to go back to a time when we were uniquely optimistic about the country at the very end of Bill Clinton's presidency. And that question was asked 25 times by Fox News, are we on the right track or headed in the wrong direction? And in almost every one of those questions, majority said the country was on the right track. But Fox followed up that question with a second question. They said, well, what about the moral climate in the United States? Is the country headed in the right direction or seriously off on the wrong track? Every time they asked that question, a majority of respondents said the country was seriously off on the wrong track in terms of its moral climate. I think that question may be a lot more about morality than it is about politics overall, and that maybe explain one of the reasons why it's been so negative for so long overall. Many things stood out to me in this poll, but the distance that ordinary people feel from key political institutions and politicians I thought was especially great. A narrow plurality in one question, 39%, said that neither candidate understands the problems of people like me. Of the remainder, slightly more, 35% said that Hillary did, 25% said that Trump did. 61% in another question, and this is one of the ones that Robbie mentioned, said that neither party represents their views, up from 48% in 1990. Not surprisingly, 77% of independents gave that response, but 54% of Republicans and 46% of Democrats did. I thought that was really a stunning response. And I think that may be one of the reasons that people feel that frank talk about the country's problems is necessary. And Robbie mentioned the question that they asked about political correctness, but I'd like to point you to another new survey that I believe Bill was on the board of, and this is one done by James Davis and Hunter and Carl Bowman, no relation, at the University of Virginia. They do a big survey every 4 years and occasionally more often than that. And they asked another question about political correctness, and they found that 73% agreed that political correctness is a serious problem in our country, making it hard for people to say what they really think. And 40% agreed strongly. That's a high level of sort of strong support. Robbie touched on the nostalgia impulse, and it's long been a prominent feature of the polls and our politics. It's certainly alive and well. And again, the country is divided about whether our best days are ahead or behind. In the UVA poll, 48% said that the U.S. was in decline as a nation. A third thought we were holding steady, and only 19% that we were improving. 68% in another question in that poll said that in general, Americans lived more moral and ethical lives 50 years ago, and that's a theme that we see in the polls about nostalgia. I want to speak a little bit more about the question in Robbie's poll on confidence in the vote and the election results. And there's a new ABC Post poll this morning that asked two questions about this. These were questions asked of likely voters. Trump has said that he thinks the election might be rigged so that Clinton could be elected through vote fraud. Do you think this is a legitimate concern, or do you think that Trump is trying to make excuses in case he loses the election? 39% said it was a legitimate concern, and 59% said that he was just simply making excuses. They asked a second question. Trump has refused to say whether or not he would accept the election's outcome if Clinton wins. Do you approve or disapprove of Trump indicating that he may not accept the election outcome? Again, overwhelming opposition to the Trump position, 64% in this new poll, including 52% who felt strongly about that, very similar to your own results, the strength of opinion on that question overall. But what I want to point out is that concern about an accurate vote count clearly predates Donald Trump. When Pew asked about confidence that your vote would be counted accurately in 2004, 2/3 said that they were very confident that their vote would be counted accurately. In 2008, that response declined 10 percentage points to 57%, and this August, when they asked the question again, only 49% said that they were confident that their vote would be counted accurately. In Gallup's question that has a slightly different twist, 81% of respondents were very confident or somewhat confident that votes would be accurately cast and counted at their neighborhood polling place. And again, but that was 81% in the new poll. That's down from 91% in 2006. In the ABC News Post polling, in the poll that they released yesterday, confidence in an accurate vote count was down 10 percentage points from 2004. So this is not new, and it has been building. Of the 28% of voters in Pew's poll, of the voters in Pew's poll, only 28% were very confident that votes across the country would be counted accurately. While Trump is clearly exacerbating this sentiment, it's part of a larger problem of democracy. It's not just the election system. Poll after poll show that Americans believe our economic system is rigged in favor of the wealthiest Americans. 73% in the UVA poll gave that response. There's also a consensus about who the economy is rigged to benefit. A majority of respondents in a new Marketplace survey said the economy was rigged for the rich, for politicians, for the media, for banks and bank executives, and corporations. In the poll, a quarter said they completely distrust the economic data reported by the federal government, including statistics like the unemployment rate and the number of jobs added. In PRI's new poll, 57% said politics and elections are controlled by people with money and big corporations, so it doesn't matter if I vote. More than 60% said the leaders in American corporations and media, universities and technology, and this is in the UVA poll, care little about the lives of most Americans. So cynicism about our politics isn't new, but the sense of powerlessness is pervasive and extends across many, many areas of American life. I'd like to take you back very briefly to the 2000 elections and concerns about the legitimacy of that vote overall. In all of the polls asked in the 34 days after the election, before the Supreme Court decided that election overall, there was no time in which Americans saw the situation as a crisis. They consistently said it was a big problem for the country, but it wasn't a crisis. Confidence in the Supreme Court to reach the right outcome was high at that point. And people continued to say that whoever won would be the legitimately elected president. And in the surveys by CNN immediately after the court's decision, solid majority said they accepted Bush as the legitimate president. I don't think that would happen today in a close election, and I think that shows how much the polarization that this survey documents so well has grown in a short period of time, and I'll end there.
Carlin, thanks so much. Perry, over to you.
Make sure can you hear me okay? Yeah. I guess first of all, I wanted to say Robbie's work, his book, I highly recommend, has been very helpful to me. I cover the election. I play an election expert on television often, and I've learned and been humbled a lot by this process because I have a piece that I usually read when I come to speak to people. The few days after Donald Trump announced his candidacy, I wrote a piece very much. I was asked to write a piece about each candidate when they announced would they win, would they not win. I was very confident about Donald Trump. I said 4 different times he would not win a single primary. Maybe 5 times, in fact, that he would not win a single primary. So I was wrong about that. But Robbie's book and his work since then has helped me kind of understand this question about why Trump did so well. And I think this question of the future and nostalgia is very important to think about as we go forward. There's a lot of commentary right now about, I'm kind of in the after Trump mood myself to talk because I assume Trump is not going to win. And so there's been a lot of commentary. In the beginning of Trump's rise, there's a lot of talk about he was the candidate doing well because of economic problems, people feeling like their wages were down, the economy was stagnant, and so on. So you had that argument for a while. And now you've had the argument for a lot of liberal writers recently saying this is really about racism, as they were saying. And so the debate about whether Trump is popular because of the economy problems or because of sort of a racism question. And I find this framing to be unhelpful. I want to get into why a little bit as we talk here. And I think that Robert's framing of it, future versus past, is a much more useful framing. And I'll start by saying, EJ has this great idea. So EJ and EJ Dion, my colleague here, and David Brooks were doing the On Being podcast, which I recommend you all listen. They were on that together. And EJ talked about the idea that Hillary Clinton should go to Appalachia after she wins the election. Go there afterward. I'm stealing EJ's idea, but and giving it as my own. But anyway, she should go to Appalachia to kind of speak to the Trump voter and do that as a way to reach out after she wins, I would say. That's a good idea, but I want to give you a little sense that the Trump voter is not necessarily a person from Appalachia. And I want to explain why a little bit here. Nate Silver wrote about this after the South Carolina primary. In South Carolina, the median Trump supporter had a household income of $72,000, while the median Clinton supporter had an household income of $39,000. Just think about that as you think about how the coverage of the year has been. Another data point is to think about is that a lot of coverage says Trump does well among the non-college educated whites, Clinton does well among the college educated whites. One thing to keep in mind is 45% of the electorate is non-college white. So it's like saying Trump is popular among men. That's a really high number of people who are non-college whites. Non-college whites are the electorate and are a very, very big portion of the electorate versus college whites are 25% of the electorate. This is a way to think about that. And the third point I wanted to make about the economy and to think about in terms of thinking about Trump is that Pew did a breakout of voter choice by income. So they looked at the fact that about 23% of the electorate has $30,000 or below income. So $30,000 or below of income qualifies you for Medicaid generally. It's a way to think about maybe a low income person. So 23% of the electorate, like I said, is people who are below $30,000. What the data showed from Pew was that about 28% of Clinton supporters had income below $30,000, and about 14% of Trump supporters did. So all making the case that when you think about the Trump supporters, not necessarily you should not think of them necessarily as a person who's laid off from their factory job or from Appalachia. That's not exactly the right way to think about it. But I do think, as the data from Robbie gets into, is a little bit, if you think about it in terms of nostalgia, or you think about it in terms of, like one of Robbie's questions is, how do you feel about America compared to the 1950s? And it's not surprising that blacks and Latinos feel like their job opportunities are higher than in the 1950s. Of course, they should obviously feel that way. And it's not surprising that some whites do not feel that way if you look at the economy. So you think about it in terms of trend lines. If you think about the question not of Trump supporters maybe in terms of stagnation as opposed to poverty, that might be the right way to think about it. And then the race question I wanted to get into a little bit too, in part because I find a lot of the commentary, particularly on the left, suggests that Trump supporters are, racist in some ways. And I think that term is sort of not true and also kind of unhelpful. We think about racism in the country in terms of kind of like Bull Connor or the 1960s. And there are some examples of that. If you look at North Carolina's voter ID law that was passed 3 or 4 years ago, I would argue that's pretty close to the sort of old style kind of racism. But we don't really have that as much in America. So I think that's not a helpful framing about it. And Robbie's book and his analysis here gets into this idea of cultural change. And I think that's a much more useful term. I mean, I'll say in my own, like we talk about political correctness a lot, I'll say in my own life, I've had to learn, I think one of the words we use when we find a black or Latino person who speaks well, we say they're articulate. That is something we should stop doing, and it may sound politically correct. We tend to call women who are supervisors bossy. Those are things that I've tried to learn in my own life. I think of someone who's fairly tolerant, but I've had to learn how to say those things differently. I think we are in an era, if that's political correctness, I think we are in an era in which people's words and behavior in certain cultural ways are examined more than ever, and I think that is. But I think that's more useful to think of as cultural change than necessarily if you call your boss, your female boss, bossy. I think that you might be sexist, but I'm not sure how useful it is to call you that. And I think that's useful to think about. What we're really experiencing is a lot of cultural change at a really rapid time, and I think that's useful to think about. And then the other thing I think about in terms of the race issue is Hillary in one of the debates tried to talk about implicit bias. I don't think she did a particularly good job of talking about that, but I do think that's a way in which if we can move the conversation in a more intelligent way about racial issues, that'll be helpful. The idea being people don't necessarily choose to go to schools with only people of their same race. It ends up, there's a lot of factors involved in property values and so on. So I think if we think about like the racial issues in a more complicated way, that'll bring us to a better discussion about what's driving the electorate. And so my final thoughts are about, and looking forward sort of after the election, I think the two things for the political system to think about are, one, is there a way to create a system in which everyone is moving forward? Like the data suggests, blacks, Latinos, people who went to college feel like they have a chance to move forward in our today's economy. Is there a way, if you're Hillary Clinton particularly, is there a way where you can think about how do we move everyone forward? And the second thing I think about is like, how do we make sure that people know that we're moving forward? Like there is some evidence that the economy has improved the last 2 or 3 years. It's not clear that people feel that way. And I do think there's a broader discussion about my industry and how we cover things in America and whether this is the best time to live in America, as some of the data suggests, or that the news we give people all the time convinces them that they live in a society that's collapsing all the time. And I think there's something that the political leadership and the more liberal of the country has to think about. How do we make sure that we create broader prosperity, and then how do we make sure people know that they're in a place that has broader prosperity? Now I'll conclude there.
Perry, thank you. You packed a lot into a very circumscribed time period. Thank you very much. Henry, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'd like to kind of combine a little bit of what Perry and Carlin were talking about in my comments, because I'd like to focus on the nostalgia and cultural change and try and ask how we as Americans deal with these feelings, especially since we are in a place and of a background where we are highly likely, if I look out on you, I would guess that well more than 66% of you would say that America has mostly changed for the better. It's very difficult to get outside of yourself and understand how other people can view things. But yet what we see from the data is that there's a very widespread feeling that is very different from the views that tend to be the way we are, that tend to be reflected in our circles. It's understandable, looking at these groups, why some of these groups would feel that America has changed for the worse. Take a look at white working class. 65% say that America's changed for the worse in the last 60 years. Well, I think if you grew up with out of college degree and you're old enough to remember that time like my father is, you could take a look and say that you would not have the same opportunities today. My dad dropped out of college, learned a trade, was able to go and buy a 1,600 square foot home, and his wife didn't have to work, and had a middle class or lower end of middle class lifestyle based on the job that he could have. There's no way he could do that today where we grew up in California. There's no way he could have the income appreciation that he's had over the last 30 years. There's no way he would have the capital appreciation that he had over the last 30 years. And then imagine people who have similar backgrounds who have even less environmental success, in the sense that you grew up in Scranton or Jonestown, where the future happened yesterday, decades ago. It's easy to understand why somebody would think that America was better 60 years ago. White evangelical Protestants who define themselves politically by their culture can easily look back and say 50 years ago most Americans shared our viewpoints. Our viewpoints on sex roles, our viewpoints on marriage, our viewpoints on the role of religion were the center of America. And today we're not only out of the center of America, but we wonder whether or not we're going to have any safe spaces left. That's what religious freedom and religious liberty is about, is not so much what people were concerned about 30 years ago, is whether they would exert their control over us, but rather, will you give us safe spaces where we can live our own lives and viewpoints? And they feel that that's not likely to happen. But I'd like to say it's not just an American phenomenon. Lord Ashcroft in England took a poll after the Brexit vote and asked, why did Britons vote that way? And he asked a question about whether Britain was better, life in Britain was better today than it was 30 years ago. And 57% of Britons said it was better, 30% said, or 43% said it was worse. Of those who thought it was better, 3/4 voted Remain. 58% of those who thought it was worse voted Leave. The same sort of people who think that America is better off and are Clinton supporters, the higher educated, the urbanites, the less religious, voted Remain. The same sort of people who are voting Trump, the lower educated, the less economically well off, the people who are outside of the major urban areas that are growing, voted Leave. What did they think was worse? He also asked a number of questions Robbie didn't ask. Which of the following is a force for ill? As you would expect, that immigration, people who voted thought was a force for ill were overwhelmingly for Leave. People who thought it was a force for good were overwhelmingly for Remain. Social liberalism was as important a divider as immigration. 80% of the people who thought that social liberalism was a force for ill voted Leave. Feminism. 74% of the people who thought that feminism was a force for ill voted Leave. The internet, 71%. Yes, that's my point about saying our life and our experience is different. That Brexit got 52% of the vote, 71% of those people, or 36% of all Britons, voted both Leave and thought that the internet was a force for ill. Okay? One of the problems and challenges we face is if the answer to the future is lean in without listening, what we get is the sort of violent, inarticulate, or somewhat what is perceived to be inarticulate reaction to the future that we are seeing in America, that we saw in Britain, and what we are beginning to see in other countries as well. That when Carlin's talking about the sense of pessimism, the sense of, I can't even say that. It's one thing to say, we're going to have a debate and you lost. It's another thing to say, it's not even proper to express your concerns. To even express your concern that's so far out of my understanding is to say something that we consider beyond the pale. That is a recipe for social division. That is a recipe, if not for violent revolution, for the sense that the system is rigged and that the appropriate response is to burn the place down. So it's incumbent on us, I think, those of us who want a responsible stewardship for all Americans and not a victory on behalf of some Americans, to look at people who think differently than us and think, how do I bring them into a conversation that they feel a part of? If the answer to our future is to lean in without listening, we will eventually see a violent revolt that will shock everyone in this room in the way that Leave shocked Britain. I'll leave with one thought that I encountered in Australia, where Australia has not had a recession in 25 years. They are a vastly prosperous country, but yet they are experiencing many of the same concerns that we are. There was a poll taken about a month ago that asked, do you think that Muslim immigration should be banned? And a majority of Australians thought it should. They have their own version. When I go to Australia, I say that, they had a populist politician 5 years ago called Clive Palmer, who was a big businessman who created a populist protest party. And they have a woman who just did well in the last election, saying Pauline Hanson, who doesn't like immigration. I say Donald Trump is somebody from Clive Palmer's background with Pauline Hanson's views. And everybody in Australia, because if there's one thing that you can agree on if you're an elite Australian, is that you don't want either of these people. But right now, her party gets 6% of the vote in the House of Representatives election in a country that has seen no economic downturn in a quarter of a century. And when I was over there in August, I went into their state broadcaster, the Australian Broadcasting Company, and I went up one elevator, and it had a big sign, a big picture on the back of the elevator. It said, "The face of the new Australia," and it was a Muslim woman. Okay, it's fine. There's a lot of Muslim immigrants. They just elected their first Muslim member of the House of Representatives out in Western Australia. So then I went in another elevator, and I saw another sign, and it was another face of the new Australia. This one was a Muslim man. Okay, when the face of the new Australia includes no faces of the old Australia, you're creating social division. When the face of the new America includes no representatives of the face of the old America, you're creating social division. And I think if we don't want increasing polarization, and we want more people to think they're represented, and we want to see more discussion and less hatred, less segregation based on viewpoint, I think we need to look about a United States that looks like all of our citizens and not simply the part that we particularly live in.
Thank you for those sobering thoughts, Henry. We are running about 10 minutes behind schedule, so I'm going to make a proposal. And that is, I'm going to turn the podium over to my colleague E.J. Dionne to pose a question to the panel as a whole. The panel will respond. If and only if there's time will I pose a question, and if there isn't time, we'll go straight to you. So over to you, E.J.
Thank you very much, Bill. First of all, I want to thank Henry, who's given me a new personal slogan, lean in, but listen hard and respectfully to those who don't. And I actually think that is going to be very, very important after this election is over. And if I may take 30 seconds, two fascinating things that Robbie didn't get to mention. One is asking Democrats and Republicans, who is your favorite president, on page 18. Democrats were all over the lot. Republicans were overwhelmingly pro-Ronald Reagan on that answer. Republicans would say, they don't have one single good one and they're all divided. Democrats would say, we have a lot to choose from. I think that's a fascinating thing to look at analytically. Secondly, and this goes to my question, Bill Bishop, as some of you know, wrote a great book, or many of you probably know, called The Big Sort, not to be confused with The Big Short. Robbie's poll shows how powerful this is. Just on page 26, more than 8 in 10 Trump supporters who attend religious services at least weekly estimate that most of their fellow church members are supporting Trump. 3/4 of Clinton supporters who attend religious services at least weekly estimate that most of their fellow church members are supporting Clinton. So we are divided everywhere, even at prayer, in terms of whom we know. And that's what I wanted to get at in my question, and it really builds on what Henry said. By the way, I also want to welcome my friend Perry Bacon, who's been a double colleague at the Post and NBC. It is so great to have you here. We argue about whether we're divided by class, race, gender, or religion. What's really scary about this poll is that we are divided by all of the following: class, race, gender, and religion. We are deeply divided by these things. I think it was Kevin Phillips who first observed that who hates whom and who hates whom the most may be the most important question in any election. And in this election, boy, do we have a lot to choose from in trying to answer that question. I'd love to ask, Henry has already given a kind of answer. I'd like to ask our other panelists, what in the world can we do after this election is over that might ease some of these divisions? We're not going to get rid of them all. We're going to argue about a lot of things. I'd just be very curious, and maybe I'll start with Robbie, who is an irenic sort of person, likes to bring people together. What do you see in all these numbers where we might focus some of our attention, not as liberals, conservatives, progressives, libertarians, as Americans, in trying to pull us together a little bit?
Yeah. So, I'll start with saying I think it's worth saying, I really resonate a lot, Henry, with what you had to say here. And I think I like to think of polling done well as an exercise in empathy, right? And kind of understanding, views that aren't your own and having the numbers sort of bring them to the surface. And sometimes there is this like head scratching moment, right? Where you see this number and but I've always thought like that's a moment to take seriously, right? Where you see this number and you don't really know what it means, or that there's something going on there. And I think a lot more of that is worth doing. I do think also that it's worth saying that the divide in the country and the cultural change is right. I think the speed of cultural change that we've had in this country is enormous and worth noting and worth like saying, wow, it's not so confusing when you really take seriously the kind of change we've had. Just two quick numbers that are sort of out of my book and that are reflected here, though, is if we look at the percentage of the country that's white and Christian, that number has gone from 2008 from being 54% of the country to being 43% of the country just since 2008. If you look at the support for same-sex marriage, right, this other issue that Henry's right was a flagship issue for conservative Christians in this country. When Barack Obama was running for president in 2008, only 4 in 10 Americans supported same-sex marriage. That number today is 62. Right? So just in the last 2 election cycles, that is an enormous amount of demographic, religious, and cultural change. So the sense that there's this vertigo among many, particularly who are on maybe the losing side of this change, and the feeling left behind is not so surprising, I think. And I do think one of the real challenges is, there's a couple of paths here. I mean, one is we can, come up with some empathy, and we could sort of follow maybe the reaching out across the lines. But I think the real threat here is that particularly without this kind of cultural center that white Protestants held in the country, they've left kind of a vacuum there as they've slipped from the center. The real threat, I think, is a kind of tribal America, right, where all of these forces, race, gender, social class, geography even, right, kind of glum together, and then you end up with these kind of factions that are kind of fight to the death factions, right? Because once something becomes kind of a tribal identity, you can't really debate it anymore, right? It's like part of who I am, and that's part of who you are, and the question is who's going to win, right? It's not really a matter of compromise anymore. And I think that's the real danger we're facing in the country, and finding some ways to diffuse that sense of tribalism and trying to find a way to kind of put things back on the table as issues and actually talk about them, and have that, even the process of having a conversation about some controversial issues, not be seen as an act of tribal betraying your tribe, I think is really going to be a challenge for us going forward.
I confess I'm not very optimistic about Washington in this regard, but I am growing more and more optimistic because of things I'm seeing in polls about a sort of a bottom-up change, where I think we are having a lot of these conversations with respect, whether it's about race and the police and other things overall. It's interesting that I don't think politics is central, the most important preoccupation to most people. I think they go about their daily lives and take the kids to the soccer games and all the rest, and politics is peripheral, not central. It's become so central in Washington that I think it's become poisonous in many ways. But At the local level, problems are being solved. If you look at the Institute of Politics Harvard polls that they take of young people every quarter, young people are much more interested in going back now to their local communities and trying to make a difference there. When I came of age, I wanted to come to Washington and make a difference, and I actually think more change will come from the bottom up, where I think there is a lot of evidence that we're more respectful of other people's views. So we'll start there.
I feel like EJS is how we're going to unify the country, and I guess the answer is I don't have a great answer to this either. But I would say Hillary Clinton is going to win the election with this very low, very, very low numbers with non-white college men particularly. Paul Ryan's party will have lost the election with very, very low numbers of minority. They both know this information. So I do think they will take steps to address that. I'm not sure how successful they will be, but I do think they will. I think you're already hearing that in some of both their rhetorics, in fact, about they're going to try to do that. I'm not sure how. And also, I think a lot of change happens top down. So I do think you might see some of the things I'm hearing about. I mean, I work at MSNBC. There's been some effort to bring more Republicans on air, I would say. I think from what I hear about what's happening at Fox, I think there'll be some effort to maybe make it some more, I don't want to use the wrong terms here, but make it more neutral or more accommodating of Democrats in some ways as well. I think those kind of changes could help. I would also say I'm not totally pessimistic for the same reasons that Carolyn was in terms of some policy changes. I don't think I would have imagined 3 years ago we would have talked about body cameras being on police officers in a broad sense. But, we had this new technology. Videos saw that. I know people say they're divided about, how the police should behave and whether they're treated well. But I think there is some broad agreement that there is some sense that there can be changes on that issue. Polling aside, I mean, Nikki Haley signed a body cameras law in South Carolina. You've seen a lot of changes in police. You've seen some discussion about policing. Newt Gingrich said, talked about the fact that if you're black, maybe there is something going on here. So I'm not totally pessimistic about every change in the country. I am pessimistic about changes in Washington.
Well, as I very much expected, the response to EJ's question has consumed the crosstalk time. So it's now time to go to you, and there will be a roving microphone. When the microphone reaches you, please state your name. If there's an institutional affiliation that you want to mention, that's fine, and ask a brief question. No speeches, please. There's no time for them. I'm going to start in the back and move forward. So I see 2 hands on the aisle back there and a woman about the 3rd aisle over there.
Hi, 2 quick questions. I'm Sally Steenland. Robbie, your numbers for evangelicals voting for Trump are pretty high. There have been press stories about how evangelicals are pulling away. I'm wondering what the real story is. And the second thing about the political correctness and talking about important issues, even if they offend people, when I heard that, I thought of Black Lives Matter and talking about that, even if it offends people. And I wonder if political correctness is a response to talking about things on the left that offend people.
No, you just pass and then go over there, please.
Tom Olson. The biggest issue that you talked about at the beginning of the presentation was terrorism, and that hasn't even come up in the conversation. I happen to think that it is a phony issue, but if everybody thinks it's really important, why do none of you think it is?
And then this woman, yes, right there.
Hi, Mackenzie Harris from Network Lobby. I'm just curious. I appreciate your explanations on political correctness, leaning in without listening, microaggressions, and social division. However, I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about whether white privilege affects that viewpoint. Thanks.
And could I invite my friend Bill to say something thoughtful in all of these answers, because I really wanted to hear from you, too.
I have many opportunities to speak, and the people in the audience have many fewer. So I may say a little something at the end if there's time, but thanks for thinking of me. So I'm going to take them in batches of 3, so now is the opportunity for the panel to respond.
All right, well, I'll take the first one off the top, the white evangelical numbers. So what we've seen among white evangelicals is very interesting. Basically, we've seen, even as the country has been moving away, or the support for Donald Trump has been sort of moving downward, white evangelical support in all of our polls of likely voters, and we had 4 straight weeks that crossed the tape release, which is kind of the more seismic event here, particularly with relation to white evangelicals, we've seen no movement among white evangelicals. 2/3 to 7 and 10, right in that range, straight across the 4 weeks among likely voters for white evangelical Protestants. So we've seen no movement. The one thing I would like to say here too, though, is that I am meaning white evangelical Protestants. There are non-white evangelical Protestants. I want to make sure I sort of put that number in. They are mirror opposites of white evangelical Protestants. 7 and 10 are supporting Hillary Clinton among non-white evangelical Protestants. So there's this like huge divide in the evangelical capital E community writ large between white evangelical Protestants and their non-white brethren in churches across their community.
I'll quickly take the terrorism question. I was surprised that it came up as the top issue in most polls, that the economy/jobs is a top issue, but terrorism almost always ranks number 2, followed by healthcare in most of the national polling. Overall, I think it is something that's on the back burner always for Americans, and part of their larger foreign policy concerns. Overall, it rises to the front burner when something happens and comes to a full boil, but there still is deep concern in the land about it, and a lot of agreement about how we address terrorism overall, I think, more so than some of the other issues. But this has really been, I wouldn't say it's been an issue-less campaign, but we've talked much more about personalities and temperament and those kinds of things than we've talked about issues throughout this campaign. So that may be why we didn't touch on it earlier.
Perry, Henry? Okay. Next 3, please. There's a gentleman over there, and then there's a bunch of hands on the aisle here.
Could you say something? My name is David Cutler. Could you say something about different age groups? There seems to have been very little in the polling which has focused on different age groups. For example, in England, it's very clear that the Brexit vote was carried by elderly people, by the older generation.
There are a couple of their hands in the aisle. Let's take the first 2 hands in the aisle coming forward, and then we'll get back in the next tranche of questions.
Yes, John Cummings, and just to follow up, to dig a little deeper on that white evangelical character, it seems, I would think some of this is an unshakable value, and I was somewhat shocked, probably the most shocking question, where that moral and ethical core so easily flipped in the matter of a couple of years. And if you could just dig into not so much the what, but why you feel that's so shakeable as a value.
And then the gentleman right in front of the gentleman who just spoke, and then we'll come forward in the next batch.
Hi, my name is John McBride, and I'm thinking about the comments about white privilege, implicit bias, and how difficult it is to get outside of ourselves to see how others see. And my question's around the daughter of a friend of mine, an undergraduate at Princeton, called and said, our professor asked us to go around the room, each say what the impact of your race has been on your life. Dad said, that must have been very interesting. She said, Dad, I didn't realize I had a race. How do you get to that sort of implicit bias that people aren't even aware of?
Okay. Reactions from the panel.
Yeah, I'll talk about the age, take a look at the nostalgia question. It was pretty much what you would expect, that the younger group was 60% mostly for the better. The oldest group was 57% for the worse. In America, the one thing you have to think about is how much of that is driven by the different racial and ethnic compositions, that the 18 to 29 group is probably about 40% non-white, whereas the 65-plus group is over 80%, 85% white. I would be interested to see if we were going to look at that as breaking that down by race, which is to say, how do 18 to 29-year-old whites feel about America 50 years ago versus 65, to tease out an age effect. But the data that we have would support exactly what you're suggesting, which is that young people are more optimistic about the future, likelier to back a candidate who would lean in, to use Robbie's chain, whereas older people are more pessimistic and are more likely to want to make America or Britain great again.
Could I say something on the white privilege question, which came up twice? I think it's very important to be candid about when looking at this poll, and a lot of it could be rewritten if you wanted to do a completely different report to emphasize how deep the racial divide is in the country, and we shouldn't sort of pretend that's not there. I also suspect, and I looked at some of the data, that if you look by region, there is a divide, particularly, say, between Southern whites, who are much more conservative on a lot of these questions, than whites in the Northeast or on the West Coast. So that's another sort of nuance there. And, you know, I talked about empathy. Empathy needs to go all the way around. I mean, Henry and I were talking, because we were talking primarily about those we think are going to lose this election, basically the Trump voters. It doesn't mean that empathy, that you can't talk about empathy toward African Americans or minorities who are also very angry about a lot of things. And last quick point, deindustrialization has hit both African Americans in the inner city hard and working class whites in communities all over the country hard. And when I try to think about how to bring us together, one way is to address those problems in tandem, because in many ways they are very similar problems. And if, in fact, Clinton wins the election, one of my hopes is that she addresses both of these at the same time, and very consciously so.
This is nostalgia for Bobby Kennedy.
Can I do one quick
Please.
riff on this? The voter fraud question, I think, casts some really interesting light on this kind of white privilege question. I also want to say, I'm guessing Henry will amen me on this, that there's also class privilege, right, that plays within the white community, and I think that's often really important to kind of help unpack this. And I think it's part of why white working class Americans feel such resentment, because I think they often get told that they're a privileged group, and the lives that they live, I think, don't reflect that very often. I think that's part of that slippage is part of what breeds some of the resentment. But I will say the voter fraud, the question about what's a bigger problem, voter fraud or voter disenfranchisement, I think casts some interesting light on this. I mean, all the best data we have shows that voter fraud in the U.S. is a negligible problem. Like the best studies that we have that have really looked at this, and yet, the country's sort of divided on this, and whites think that's a bigger problem than voter disenfranchisement, where we have solid evidence and history, right, that show that voter disenfranchisement, particularly for minorities and African Americans in the South, has been a pretty open problem that we've had in the country. And I think the huge divide, I mean, African Americans are like 2-to-1. No, actually, disenfranchisement is the bigger problem, and whites are sort of leaning the other way, is a classic case of kind of this kind of racial perception gap that we have in the country. And did you want to address the evangelical flip? You wrote about this.
I've had my say.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
There's a great piece Bill wrote in the Brookings FixGov blog, right, on this evangelical flip piece. Yeah, I would recommend.
I think there were 4 terms used: implicit bias, political correctness, white privilege, Black Lives Matter. We didn't do a poll on them. My suspect is people don't even agree on what those terms mean. So that's so it's much deeper than just we don't know how we feel about them, but I suspect we don't really even know what the Black Lives Matter activists think they're saying versus how it's being heard is a totally different thing. I think the term white privilege is if you read in Hillary's, the Podesta emails, actually, there's a debate in Hillary's staff about, do we use the term white privilege? And one of her black advisors is like, don't do that. No one knows what that means, and it's going to be somewhat unpopular. So there's a lot of these terms I think it's good we're having a more open discussion about racial issues, but that said, we're at the very early stages of that. Sorry, we've had a long country, the history of the country has been long. We've talked about race all during it, but these last couple of years we've had a more focused conversation, and I feel like people are still learning the right terms, learning how to think about it. I think that's great the professor asked that question. I'm not surprised people don't necessarily I'm not sure if you asked me exactly how does my race affect my life, I'm not sure I'd have a great answer myself, and I guess I'm assumed to have a better answer than most people in the room, but I don't think I have that answer either. I think it's a hard question, but I'm glad we're thinking about these questions.
Very good. So, continuing our march forward, there's a woman right on the aisle there, and then I'm going to bring it forward on this side, and then I'm going to turn to this side.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a physician. My question is for Mr. Olson, and it's white evangelicals again. If they're concerned by this rapid change in morality and the LGBT thing and the fact that they have to bake cakes for same-sex couples, why didn't Ted Cruz beat Trump.
Yes. Next question, please. Okay, there's a woman here.
There is a segment of evangelical Christians who are concerned about climate change, believe in stewardship, the responsible moral stewardship. And I wonder, and there's nothing on the environment, at least in the handout we received. So I'm also wondering, looking forward, is there a way with infrastructure spending on national parks, on clean water, to bridge sort of a cross strain of the American public?
Yes, let me just deal with this final question back there, and then we'll come forward in the next set.
My name is James Blanton. I'm a historian and a writer based here in D.C. And so I wanted to go back to what Robert was saying about voter fraud as an example of what I'm going to talk about. So let's say, I have a PhD. I live in Washington, D.C. I grew up in rural Alabama. And what I see from my friends back home is an intense distrust of experts. And so if I were to go to them and say, studies show that voter fraud is a minimal, almost non-existent problem, they will reject that right away. And so my question is basically, from the position of an expert, how do you talk to the non-expert and just get them to participate in the dialogue?
All right, panel.
I'll answer the one directed at me. Evangelicals, like any other group, can be divided into subgroups, and there are people who care more about cultural issues and people who care less about cultural issues. The data suggests that among the Republican evangelicals who care most about social issues, Ted Cruz did win. He tended to beat Donald Trump among very conservative voters in the South that had high concentrations of evangelicals, even in Indiana, which is probably the most evangelical primary state outside of the Deep South. He won very conservative voters while losing by 16 points across the state. Ted Cruz had no appeal whatsoever to the person who was not a very conservative voter. He got annihilated among the 20% of Republicans who said they were moderate. He lost handily among the people who told pollsters they are somewhat conservative. He got annihilated among Republicans who said that they were neither evangelical Protestants nor among those who didn't attend, where they might have said they were evangelical, but they didn't attend services. Basically, he niche marketed to the very conservative fiscal and social conservative, and discovered, surprise, that they're not a majority of the Republican Party. Some of us had only been saying that for a year and a half. But that's pretty much the answer of why they may have had those concerns, but when it came to social issues versus other things, there was that division, and the social issues, conservative evangelical voted with Ted Cruz, but the person who may have shared the concerns but prioritized them less voted for Donald Trump.
Other reactions?
In response to your question about how do you convince people of the truth of expert analysis, I was reminded of an essay that Dan Yankelowitz, the great sociologist, wrote many years ago, in which he said that journalists, people with PhDs, they think that the accumulation of factual information is the royal road to judgment. He said publics rarely ever think that way. You've got to start those conversations with values, not with facts, because first of all, we're factually challenged in so many ways. I mean, all of us are. And he said he actually thinks the public's approach through values in terms of understanding public policy issues, fairness, honesty, accuracy, is a much more successful approach than the approach of elites. And that essay has stuck with me for a very long time. And just a second quick point, Bill, I don't know what you said about the flip of the white evangelicals on the character issue. For me, it party trumped their religious values overall, and I think we saw the same thing. I hope I'm not being politically incorrect here. We saw the same thing in the 1990s when, for decades, feminists had told us that the personal was the political, and all of a sudden, during the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, everything flipped, and the personal was no longer the political. And so I think because party was more important than the issue for feminists overall.
Well, when I was a teenager, I was involved, much to my surprise, in some of the early experiments on cognitive dissonance. And it seems to me that human beings, and voters are human beings, even though I sometimes doubt it, that human beings will work very hard to minimize cognitive dissonance. And if it means starting with your conclusion and working back to your values, people will do that. And if people have decided they're going to vote for Donald Trump, despite the fact that his sexual behavior is, if I may use the word, deplorable, then they're going to retrofit their other beliefs to be consistent with that conclusion. Perry, you look as though you want to say something.
Let's go to the next question.
Fair enough. Okay, this regrettably. Oh, I'm sorry, Rob.
Just the climate change. So, I think unfortunate news, if you're a climate change advocate, is that issue almost always ranks at the bottom of priority lists. Like when we put it up on that big list I had, we didn't have it on the survey, but if I had, it would be down at the bottom, and it would be down at the bottom for Republicans, it would be down at the bottom for Democrats, it would be down at the bottom for young people, it would be down at the bottom for older Americans. It just hasn't really taken off as a kind of critical issue, at least the way we measure it in surveys. The other thing to say about white evangelicals is the great hope here had been that younger white evangelicals would be the ones who would sort of stand up. And one of the things that we've seen, though, is that, for example, we don't see any generational differences in support for Donald Trump between older and younger evangelicals. Now, that's going to be surprising to a lot of people in the room, but one of the reasons why we're not seeing that is because the more liberal younger evangelicals left. Right, they left to become, and most of them left to become nothing. They left to balloon that group of religiously unaffiliated people that we now make up 39% of Americans under the age of 30. Right, so that's what has been happening. Is that the kind of more liberal cohort that would have brought those issues in has migrated out of the category.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Because this is a panel on survey research, I'm going to do a quick poll of my own. Is there anybody on the panel who cannot stay for an additional 15 minutes?
15, but only 15. I have a 12:30 conference call.
Okay, well, I found the sweet spot, and I asked that because I'm a veteran observer of crowds, and this is a full room, and I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of people who've gotten up and left. That tells me that there's still a lot of interest and a lot of questions. So now, I'm going to go to this side of the room, this gentleman with the clerical collar right there, and then we'll move forward.
Sorry, Tom Reese from the National Catholic Reporter. Granted the divisions that this study has found, and also granted the concern about political parties, the disillusionment with political parties and the political process, how scared are you by the response on authoritarian leadership? The fact that I think it's 46% of the respondents said that they would like to see a leader who was willing to break the rules in order to get things done.
Yes, this woman right here, second row.
Hi, Kristen Cabral with Progressive Democrats of America and the Women's National Democratic Club. This is primarily for EJ. Tom Hayden died yesterday. Given this survey, are we living yet in a true participatory democracy, something he fought for his whole life?
Then there's a young man with his hand raised, the fourth row, I believe.
Noah Joseph, Indiana University student and a participant in the Washington Leadership Program this semester. Charles Barkley, an NBA basketball player, recently came out and stated that rather than race relations, the real problem facing America is the gap between the wealth and the poor that is stemming the frustration in America. Robbie, this is in particular for you. Is there any data to support that statement?
I think we've had 3 questions now, so I'll take the remaining questions in the next batch. That's a promise.
Are you looking at? I'll take the Charles Barkley question quickly. I mean, it's sort of this is why we don't ask Okay, let me stop that comment. But wealth and race are highly correlated. So, I mean, I find that statement to be not super helpful. Yes, there's a huge gap between the wealthy and the poor, and there's a huge gap on race. And part of that is that blacks and Hispanics have much lower net wealth, much more or less lower household incomes, et cetera. So, I mean, it's not surprising so those things could have correlate with each other in some ways. In some ways they don't, but in a lot of ways they do.
I am just on the Tom Hayden question briefly. Thanks for that question. If anybody, probably most people in this room never read the Port Huron Statement, but you did, of course, which was the founding document for SDS before SDS went absolutely bonkers in the late 60s. And it's a really remarkable document where some of the sentences, I suspect, would appeal to Trump voters in its emphasis on a democracy of participation. Just two sentences really on Tom Hayden, on where Hayden was coming from. On the one hand, I always thought the challenge for the New Left was it emphasized a kind of participatory democracy, and where it wasn't clear what the connection was between that notion of democracy and representative democracy. And I think one of the fascinating things about Hayden's life is that he later himself realized that you needed to link participatory democracy to the traditional political system, that you couldn't stay outside of it. It's the way I think of Occupy Wall Street versus the Bernie Sanders campaign. Bernie realized electoral politics was a necessary route to change. And I think that's an insight that people who, on the progressive side, constantly need to keep in mind. But the alienation that was spoken about in that statement, while it tended to be and was quite candid in being the alienation of upper middle class students, even though Hayden himself was very working class in his background, there's something there that's worth revisiting, because I think the spirit of the Port Huron Statement still has a lot to teach us about some of the shortcomings of our politics, even if I think there were holes in its analysis.
Well, I'll jump in on the authoritarianism question. So thanks, Tom, for raising that question. It is an interesting question. So the way the question read, it's on page 16 if you've got the report. But it read this way: do you agree or disagree? Because things have gotten so far off track in this country, we need a leader who is willing to break some rules if that's what it takes to set things right. And it turns out the racial divides on this question are fairly modest, but the class divides are very big. So if you look at the difference between white college-educated and white working-class Americans, a majority, 55% of white working-class Americans agree with that statement. Only 29% of white college-educated Americans agree with that statement. To me, I think, I see this as it fits very well with this portrait of Americans who see a very non-responsive political system to their situation, right? And so when you feel like there's parties aren't attuned to you, the government's not attuned to you, nobody's got your back, this kind of sentiment, I think, is what you get, right? And if you get a strong leader who's promising to sort of come in and shake things up, I do think that has been part of Trump's appeal, really, as someone who's said, I'm the guy, only I can solve this problem. When he made those kinds of statements, I think it's appealing to this kind of sentiment. But it's to people who feel like the system has largely failed them, right? And they don't see many paths working within the current channels to changing things.
And that gets to the importance of listening, which is to say that when people feel excluded from a normal process and from a society, they will endorse extreme measures in order to ensure that they get part of that society. And I think there is a segment that we don't often come in contact with, except through data, that very much feels that way. And they find Trump's authoritarian demeanor reassuring rather than frightening.
I think my answer to Father Tom is we should be scared by this, and it does show a breakdown in our system. And for those, by the way, just on Tom Hayden, if anybody wants to read the Port Huron Statement, I tweeted it out in his honor yesterday. So if you look at my Twitter feed, even though I have, as I say, it's imperfect, but it's admirable in a whole lot of ways.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I saw that question as just much more of an expression of deep frustration and not sort of a willingness to have an authoritarian leader. I think a lot of Hillary Clinton supporters could agree with some parts of that statement. But the system's working for people in the white college group. It's not working for the others. And so it's that deep frustration that we don't seem to understand.
Okay, final batch of questions. I'm going to take, I'm going to take 4. There are a couple of young women back there and 2 gentlemen up here, and I'm sorry about everybody else. I've done my best.
Hi, my name is Betsy Shirley. I'm at Sojourners. Robbie, I had a question for you. There was a question about women in political leadership, gender-based double standards. Was curious if you had information on religious breakdown of that feeling, or if you didn't, what you think that might show.
I'm Casey Hoare, and I'm curious about the question on immigrants, or their Americans' feelings towards immigrants. Is this something that has gotten more negative over time, or is this something that really has stayed about even as it is today?
Good question. Okay, there's a gentleman right here and then one in the front row.
David Smith of The Guardian. Do you think, is there evidence in the survey that if Trump had been much more self-disciplined and we'd not had the videotape and not had him picking these fights with the Khan family and so on, that he could have won if he'd been more on message, or were the demographics always loaded against him?
Sure.
Thank you, Larry Checco. I think it's going to segue somewhat with Henry on listening and who are people listening to. For example, I bandy between CNN and Fox, and it's like I'm living in 2 alternate universes. I mean, you don't even think you're listening to the same election proceeding. And how do people? I guess what I would like to know, Robbie, is could there be a question asked in another survey as where people get their information from? Because that's what's educating them, quote unquote.
I'll take the gentleman from The Guardian's question. There was always going to be a challenge for a host of reasons, but twice in the campaign, Trump stayed within some degree of normal campaigning behavior for about a 3-week period, and both times he rose in the polls and came very close to parity with her. The most recent time was when he dumped Manafort and hired Bannon and Conway, and that was about a 3-week period where he stopped tweeting at 3 in the morning, and he was talking about outreach to African Americans, and his poll rating, his favorable, unfavorable over a span of 3 weeks went from -30 to -19, and then it stopped at the first debate, and now it's been going backwards. So I think what's pretty clear is that there was a majority to be had for a non-Hillary Clinton Republican who represented change, that Donald Trump niche marketed to people who wanted radical change, and he was never able to pivot to the people who wanted safe change.
Other responses?
Go ahead, Robbie. Well, I'll answer the question about. So we have a fairly long trend on this question about whether immigrants, threaten traditional customs values or whether they strengthen American society. They look pretty flat, actually. We haven't seen a lot. There's been some kind of ups and downs, but we go back to 2011. They look kind of right on top of where they are today, and then they move a little bit in 2015. But I would say the pattern, there's no distinct pattern. They kind of bounce around a little bit. The other thing to say is that there's been absolutely no movement on the immigrant question on policy on this. We started asking this question in an early Brookings PRI survey back in 2013 about a path to citizenship. 6 in 10 Americans support a path to citizenship, including a half of Republicans. And that has not changed. We've asked this question, I think, over 100 times since 2013 and today of more than 100,000 Americans, and it has just not moved. It is tabletop flat. So that's a kind of interesting. Only about 3 in 10, even Republicans, want to see deportation as the policy of the U.S. I have to come back to you on here's the women political leaders question. My guess is that we'd see white evangelicals in particular, since you're from Sojourners, being a little more reticent about women leaders. But I have to look and see. I mean, generally speaking, traditional gender roles has been kind of a marker of evangelical kind of morality and values.
To get at your sort of media question a little bit, I read a survey, and I can't recall where I read it, but anyway, it suggested essentially there's a fraction of Americans who are very politically engaged. They use Twitter, they watch cable news, they read they read these sort of elite publications, and they do tend to live in a left-right universe. They read Daily Kos and they watch MSNBC, and they don't, or they consume Fox. But the majority of Americans, interestingly, still consume local newspaper, NBC News, broad kind of, Yahoo News, which, I don't read, but it's like MSN.com, sort of broader websites. So it's not as if people are living, the parallel universe experience is actually more of an elite one than for most people who, like you said, are not consumed by political news. Thank goodness for them. And I guess I would say in terms of how does it affect issues? What I would say is I think there's room to maneuver and compromise on issues that are not part of that partisan matrix. Like, people are not going to come together on Obamacare at this point. I think that's pretty in the partisan matrix, for example. But the poll actually showed people's support for restoring voting rights for felons. Republicans, Democrats, Independents, majorities of all those groups support that. And my suspicion for that is that that's not an issue that's yet become, Donald Trump has not announced he's against that, and I think Obama is for that. I think they'll know that. But it's not clear to me that's become an issue that's sort of become part of the national political debate in a way that other issues do. Once an issue gets in that national political debate, Fox picks its side, MSNBC Fox picks its side, other, liberal Daily Kos picks its side. You get to that partisanship quickly on issues where that hasn't, people I don't think didn't know what is my view on body cameras for police officers. That view is not necessarily predetermined by the parties, so it gave a little bit of room to maneuver in.
I agree totally with Perry. I just want to point out a few reports ago, we did an interesting analysis of viewership. And to me, the most interesting thing was the difference between Fox News Republicans and non-Fox News Republicans on a lot of issues. Now, we don't know which way the causal arrow goes. Like, you choose to watch Fox, therefore you have these views, or you watch Fox and you're moved toward these views. But there is clearly that split. Having said that, I think it's really important to underscore what Perry said, which is a whole lot of Americans are not addicted to any of these networks.
Thank God. Well, let me just conclude this marvelously spirited panel and inclusive question and answer session with one comment, and that is that in many respects, what we're talking about in this survey is not an exclusively American phenomenon. You see similar demographic splits throughout the advanced market economies. And I remember how startled I was when I listened to the analysis of the Brexit vote into the wee hours of the morning, and if you changed the nouns and the accents, you would have thought that they were talking about the U.S. election. And in country after country in Europe, you see these same divisions emerging. We are, whether we know it or not, in the grips of much larger historical forces. We have to get our minds around those forces and then figure out distinctively American responses to them. Thank you very much to the panel and the audience.